Hey, stick with me for a second before we start, because I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you actually happened this week, and I had to fact check it twice, because it reads like satire even when it isn't. There is a very specific kind of behavior that shows up when someone spends months bragging about a brand new toy in front of everyone, tells every camera in the room how magnificent it is, how there's never been one like it, how it's the greatest aircraft in the history of flight. And then, the very first time it actually needs to fly through anything dangerous, quietly swaps it for the old one and hopes nobody notices the driveway is empty. That is more or less what happened to the President of the United States this week in Turkey, and of course, everybody noticed. Donald Trump left the NATO summit in Ankara not aboard the new Qatari-gifted $400 million Boeing that he personally unveiled a few weeks ago as very unique, but aboard one of the old Boeing C-25, as that have been flying presidents since the Cold War. The official story was that the new plane needed to make a quick detour to a U.S. air base in England so soldiers could take photos with it. The actual story, according to the New York Times and confirmed by multiple U.S. outlets since, is that the Secret Service specifically advised the president not to fly the new jet out of Turkey because the older aircraft comes equipped with missile countermeasure systems and communications hardening that nobody is entirely sure the new one has yet. Reporters on board were told to close their window shades before takeoff. Flight trackers lost the plane's transponder signal shortly after departure. None of that is standard procedure for a routine flight home from an Allied summit. That is standard procedure for flying somebody out of a war zone, which, as it turns out, is not far from what Turkey currently is, at least from Tehran's perspective, because the ceasefire with Iran that Trump spent months celebrating as one of the great diplomatic achievements of his presidency collapsed again this week after Iranian strikes on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz prompted the U.S. to carry out fresh airstrikes across roughly 90 targets inside Iran. Oil jumped more than 6% in a single day. Gas prices at home ticked up almost overnight. And Trump, standing at a podium in Ankara, told reporters the ceasefire was over and that further negotiation would be a waste of time. 4 words that, if you are an oil trader, an airline, or frankly anyone who buys gasoline, are considerably more expensive than they sound. Now here is where it gets interesting, because a reporter from the New York Post did the one thing everyone else in that room seemed reluctant to do, which was simply ask the question directly. Was the plane switch about security? Was it about Iran? Was it specifically about the fact that Trump himself has spent the last several days telling anyone who would listen that he personally sits atop Iran's kill list? And Trump did not deny it. He didn't confirm it either. Not exactly, because that would require a level of directness this administration has never once shown when the honest answer might actually alarm people. Instead, he did what he always does, which is talk around the question until the question forgets what it was asking. He mentioned that being president carries roughly a 5.2% chance of assassination, a statistic he appears to have generated independently, possibly while looking in a mirror, compared this favorably to bull riding, and then landed, almost as an aside, on the line that actually mattered. "I'm number 1 on the kill list for Iran," he said. "They're lovely people." I want you to sit with that phrasing for a second because it is doing a lot of work. He is simultaneously telling you he might be a target for assassination by a foreign government and describing that government as lovely in the same breath, with the same tone you'd use to describe a neighbor who occasionally borrows your lawnmower. That is not confidence. That is not even good theater. That is a man who has said the sentence so many times it has stopped registering as information and started functioning as filler, the verbal equivalent of clearing your throat. And then, because consistency has never been the point, Trump spent the next several minutes of that same press conference praising his own negotiating team for dealing with very fine people in Tehran, before immediately reversing course and calling those same officials cuckoo and scum who want to kill me. A reporter, reasonably, pointed out that a month ago he'd called the Iranian leadership rational, strong, smart people he could do business with. His answer amounted to, "I gotta know them better," which is one way of admitting that his entire foreign policy toward a nuclear-adjacent regional power appears to be running on vibes that update roughly every 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how the last phone call went. Let's talk about the money for a second, because somebody has to, and it clearly isn't going to be the White House Communications Office. That new Air Force One was gifted by Qatar last year, under intense conflict of interest scrutiny that the administration waved off at the time as paranoid. The Air Force has publicly said the retrofit cost under $400 million. Multiple aviation analysts and at least one Forbes investigation put the real number closer to $1 billion once you account for the engineering work that reportedly had to be rushed or skipped entirely to get the plane flying in time. The same engineering work, notably, that may be the reason it currently can't be trusted to fly its own owner out of a hostile neighborhood. So to summarize the position the United States currently finds itself in, it accepted a luxury aircraft from a foreign government, spent what may be close to $1 billion taxpayer dollars retrofitting it under time pressure, unveiled it as the pinnacle of presidential air travel, and then, 3 weeks into actually using it, quietly declined to fly it anywhere near an active security threat. If you did this with a car, your insurance company would have some very pointed follow-up questions. Meanwhile, back at the summit itself, NATO allies who had spent weeks bracing for Trump to walk in furious idicchu about Greenland, about Spain refusing to let its bases be used for strikes on Iran, about defense spending, got, by most accounts, a noticeably calmer version of him behind closed doors than the one performing for cameras outside. He didn't threaten to pull out of the alliance, which under different circumstances might sound like good news, except the bar for good NATO summit has apparently been lowered to the president did not attempt to dissolve the alliance this week. He did, however, tell reporters that European leaders had told him, and I am quoting the president quoting unnamed grown adults, "We love you, sir," which is either the most reassuring thing said at a NATO summit in years, or the most obvious thing a group of leaders who need something from Washington could possibly say to the one man who controls whether they get it. I will let you decide which of those explanations requires you to believe fewer coincidences. Somewhere in the middle of all this, Trump also found time to tell the assembled press that he would be the greatest communist in history, a line delivered as mockery of free housing and rent proposals, but one that, out of context, sounds less like political commentary and more like something a biographer includes in Chapter 14. He also mentioned, unprompted, that he is currently the #1 creator on TikTok, a platform his own administration spent 2 years trying to ban outright over national security concerns tied to a foreign government, which is a genuinely remarkable achievement in getting to have it both ways. So here's the actual through line, because all of this, the plane, the kill list, the ceasefire collapsing for what feels like the 3rd or 4th time this year, the oil markets flinching every time he opens his mouth in a press conference, it isn't really about any one of those things individually. It's about what happens to a country's credibility when its own government appears less certain of its safety than its adversaries are of their threats. The United States spent decades building an image of Air Force One as untouchable, a flying fortress that projected strength simply by existing. This week, for the first time in that plane's modern history, the message it sent by not flying said more than the message it would have sent by flying. Every ally at that summit saw it. Every adversary watching from Tehran saw it too, and the American taxpayer, who is currently paying more at the pump because a ceasefire fell apart somewhere between a Truth Social post and a live press conference, is left holding a bill for a plane that may be too new to trust, and an old one that, this week at least, apparently still does the job. I'm Marcus Fenn, this is Borderlines. And if there's one thing you should take from all of this, it's that the country capable of building the most expensive aircraft on Earth still can't quite decide which one it feels safe getting on. Subscribe if you'd like to keep watching that, get sorted out in real time.